Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Jim Surratt, and today we're going to be talking about using strongman training for the tactical population. Now, why strongman? Well, first and foremost, I've started doing it. I competed in a powerlifting competition probably about 3, maybe 4 weeks ago now at this point, and I need a change, right? So I spent about 6 months training up for this competition that I had in November. If you want to check that out, it's on my Instagram. Didn't do as well as I wanted, but that's the name of the game, right? So I spent about 6 months or so training up for this competition, and I'm just burnt out on squat, bench, and deadlift, right? At least in my gear, at least in a powerlifting context. Like, I have no desire to put a barbell on my back. I really don't care about my bench, just because of what I got going on with my neck and my tricep. There's only so much I can do about that. And then deadlift I'm doing just because it fits into the strongman training, right? So because I got burnt out on powerlifting, I decided to look into strongman competitions. I always loved watching strongman. I think it's super fun, super cool. Some real monsters, especially up at like the professional level. Absolute units of people, of human units. And it just looks fun, right? And it looks like you can get brutally fucking strong doing it. Not that you can't doing powerlifting or even bodybuilding, right? Or like functional fitness. Like, there's plenty of ways to get strong, right? But I think there's something really, I don't want to use the term primal because that's kind of, but very fundamental about picking a heavy weight up off the ground or carrying literally a big rock, you know. Something very grounding about it, I think, in the world of strength and strength sports. It just looks fun. It looks different, you know, and it's a little bit of a challenge. Or it's gonna be a hell of a challenge, actually. This show that I'm doing coming up here in about 25 days, 26 if you count today. So the competition I'm doing, just so we're all on the same page, you understand kind of where I'm coming from with the rest of the spiel, is there's a max log press. So you have 3 attempts to work up to a max. You have an axle deadlift. This is a deadlift bar deadlift that I did today. It went terribly. But I pulled 565 on the axle bar, which is the competition weight. So I just have to do that for reps. A yoke carry to a sled drag, both of which are going to be very challenging. And then finally a natural, so natural meaning oddly shaped as compared to round or square, natural stone shoulder for reps. So things completely outside of my wheelhouse other than maybe the deadlift. I mean, I worked for a mason for many years, so I'm used to carrying rocks. But I haven't done that in 20 years, almost 20 years. So a lot of practice with that. But so one, it's fun, and two, I think I hate the term functional. I really hate it. I think it's bandied about and abused and overused, but I really think that in the context of this conversation, you could argue that strongman training for the tactical population is very functional, right? And why do I say that? Well, because if you're looking at strongman, not just from like being a giant human being and lifting boulders and, you know, 400 and some odd pounds over your head on an axle, like, right, there's extremes. Like, just like with powerlifting, there's an extreme. Right, so let's go back to powerlifting. So I use the conjugate method, as I've talked about a whole bunch of times, and I train my operators in a powerlifting-esque framework, right? Squat, bench, deadlift, but then we also throw in conditioning. We don't throw in, but we include conditioning, we include GPP. So we look at things not just from the perspective of how strong can we get you, but how physically prepared can we get you. That's the whole point of strength and conditioning in the tactical field. It's not about peaking for a specific event. It's like, how well prepared can we make you from a physical perspective? That is my job, right? Is to provide sound, dedicated, and pertinent, relevant training for a population that engages in events and tasks that are typically beyond the norm. Let's put it that way. So powerlifting works, right? Or a powerlifting framework works to develop maximal strength, right? But we have to have the accessory movements, the GPP, the conditioning, all that kind of stuff, right? So in the similar sense, or in the same vein, I guess you could say, you could argue that strongman, from the perspective of carrying odd objects and, you know, sort of like more work capacity based strength, as compared to the true maximal strength, is just as effective as at building, again, maybe not necessarily maximal strength unless you are like, pushing the limits on like your deadlift or your press or something like that, right? But strongman, I think, is really good for developing, I don't want to say submaximal, it's called like circummaximal functional strength, because the bulk of what you are lifting is heavy, right? Like very rarely in a strongman competition or in a strongman training cycle are you going to do light things, right? Now there may be lighter warm-ups, accessories, that type of stuff, right? But you're carrying heavy odd objects. You're carrying sandbags, stones, Husafels, Zerchers, dumbbells, farmer's carries, all that kind of stuff, right? So you're doing all this like inherently cardiovascular, not specific, but relevant or adjacent, I guess you could say, work, as well as doing strength work. Now, how would I marry this sort of newly developing, this blossoming, burgeoning interest in sort of functional fitness, functional strength and conditioning, quote unquote, with my love for the conjugate method and powerlifting? So I will never deny that this job provides me the good fortune of doing a lot of things that I might not be able to otherwise do from a coaching perspective, right? Like I have a phenomenal facility. I have all the resources and all the tools and stuff that I could want to coach and to program. Do I have absolutely everything? No. I don't have a monolith. But again, we don't need it, right? And it comes down to not what I want, but what do the guys need? What does the population need? But we have an outdoor field, outdoor turf that's covered. And so my idea is that let's turn that into a sort of strongman circuit area. So sandbags, Husafel crosses, rickshaws, that kind of stuff, right? Because if you look at it from just a very general perspective, if we eliminate the whole idea of specificity, or generality, meaning that like what are we doing specific, relevant, and contextual to the task at hand, right? If you sort of just eliminate the idea of acute specificity entirely and say, you know what, we're just going to move under load, right? At the end of the day, that's what operators do. Okay, I mean, yes, like there's so much more than that, right? But if we're talking just from a physiological perspective, they move, they operate, they execute, they function under load, right? And so that's not to say that every single movement that we have to do has to be under load, or that we're going to do like agility drills and quick feet and all that kind of obstacle courses under load, right? I think there's a time and a place for like obstacle course, but that's a wholly different conversation, right? So we're not going to do silly stuff, right? But I think the idea of moving at a pace, right, not just walk, right, at a pace under load is, in terms of, again, sort of obtuse specificity rather than acute specificity, applicable to the tactile population. Now, you could easily argue, if you wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of it, you could argue that the only thing that is specific to the tactile population is engaged in tactical specific execution, right? Moving with kit and load, moving with a weapon, transitioning from prone to half kneeling to vertical to moving under load with a weapon, all that kind of stuff, right? You could easily argue that that is tactical specific, 100% accurate, right? But again, that's not my field, right? I'm not an operator. I'm not a tactical coach, right? Like I don't know anything about gun work, I don't know anything, right? I know how to point and pull. That's about it. But beyond that, I'm not the guy to come to. So, but what I do know is strength and conditioning. So again, if we're looking at things from the perspective of how do I get these guys as generally fit as possible, let's play it. So we need not only, it's a two-pronged approach, okay? And forgive me as I get tangential and ramble, but I'm developing these thoughts as I go, right? So it's a two-pronged approach. So if we look at things from first group, this is gonna be a really good analogy. So first group, or special forces, often refers to itself as the tip of the spear, right? So a spear is a thrusting and piercing weapon, right? So it needs to be broad enough to create damage, right, to lacerate and to absorb that impact as it punctures, but it also needs to be honed enough to penetrate with as much ease as possible, right? So tactical training, tactical strength and conditioning is sort of like that, okay? You need to have a broad face, but you also need to have a very honed edge, which is sort of like, contradiction, right? Because like, so if we're going back to the blade analogy, like a cleaver, right? Like a meat cleaver has a broad face. This is for chopping, right? Whereas like a fillet knife has a very honed edge because it's designed for cutting, right? So it's two different utilizations of the same sort of concept of the same technology. But that's what we deal with in tactical strength and conditioning is the need for God, my hat will not get right. The need for a broad face, the capacity to do a lot of different things, but also the ability to refine, hone, and focus that ability or that capacity, that operational capacity to a very specific point, right? So I've said a lot of words. I basically just Kamala Harris my way through that. But the idea again is that we have to be able to do a lot of things very well and a few things excellently, right? So again, how does strongman training play into the development of tactical operators or tactical athletes? Well, again, it's very useful for developing. You can develop maximal strength, absolutely, right? So I mean, typically, if we're looking at just pure strongman, typically you don't see very many squats, right? At least not in competition. Right, in training, absolutely, right, but you don't see too many like strongman competitions that have a squatting event, right? Now that's not to say that just because strongman competitions don't have squats, that if you're using quote strongman training, you cannot or should not include squatting in your programming, right? Because squatting is again, if we look at it from just a fundamental perspective, a very basic motor pattern or movement pattern, right? These guys have to be able to squat and bend down, so they have to be able to operate again under load, right? Through range of motion, through space. So you could easily put in a squat. If you wanted to bench them, you could bench them. You could overhead press them, and then you can deadlift them, obviously, right? So strongman revolves around the deadlift, around carrying and picking up heavy objects. So deadlift is obviously a fantastic, or a very, not necessarily fantastic, that's the wrong word, an integral part of any sort of strongman-esque style of programming. But what else would you do, right? So I mean, so let me back up. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So again, you can develop absolute like brute freak strength, I think, relative, right, to the individual, pulling heavy deadlifts, whether it's an axle bar or a stiff bar or a deadlift bar. I've come to actually not like this deadlift bar very much from a conventional perspective. I just feel so bound up and I can't pull as much as I normally do. That's probably a me issue, not the bar issue, obviously, but like I pulled 565 on the axle and it wasn't pretty, but I got it done, right? It wasn't bad, and today I pulled 495 on this deadlift bar. And that's probably, I mean, you know, the spillover effect, right? The accumulated fatigue of training multiple two-a-days. We've been on holiday leave, so I've been doing multiple two-a-days at the gym, coming down here every day or every other day to lift heavy. So there's a lot going on, right? But you can get really strong, again, doing strongman stuff, deadlifting, pressing, and I think so many times we are afraid as strength conditioning professionals to go into that overhead space, right? Because people are like, well, don't go overhead, it's dangerous, it'll hurt your shoulders. Both those things are true, right? But so can bench press, but we're not scared to bench press people, right? But we're scared to put people overhead. So if you sort of change up your approach, like, because the whole idea of the conjugate method, right, is identifying strengths and weaknesses through exposure to max effort, and then utilizing secondary, tertiary, and accessory exercises to shore up and reinforce not only your strengths, but also build up your weaknesses, right? So I just ran, like I have a team, okay, one of my ODAs, they've been with me for probably 4 or 5 months at this point. And we've done, you know, conjugate-based or conjugate structured powerlifting base program, right? We've gotten very strong. We've done chains, bands, we've done all the bars, all that kind of stuff. You guys have gotten very strong. But we don't spend a whole lot of time overhead, right? Because some guys do have jacked up shoulders that won't allow them to go overhead very well. And so with guys like that, you have to be able to find either a workaround or a substitute. But with everybody else, it's like, why not do it, right? So like, why not press overhead? Why not put more heavy things overhead? And like, it's all relative, right? I'm not saying somebody needs to go max effort overhead press. I don't think that's a great, I think that's a great ROI, return on investment for an operator, right? A strongman competitor, a power lifter, an Olympic lifter, a CrossFitter, whatever, absolutely, you know, go put something heavy over your head. But you are incurring and you are accepting that risk that something could happen based on what you're doing, right? And I've talked about it before, but in the context of tactical strength and conditioning, I have to understand that what happens in here cannot negatively or has to have a absolutely minimal negative impact on what happens out in the field, right? If I get a guy hurt in here and then he becomes a liability to his team, I've put that entire team at jeopardy, right? That's on me. At the end of the day, that's how I see it. So I have to be very precise and very coordinated about how I organize my training and what I include and what I exclude, right? So not only can you get maximally strong, but you can get very circummaximally or submaximally strong, right? Repetition effort. So pulling sleds, whether like dragging them or hand over hand, doing farmer's carries with either the farmer's carry implements or kettlebells or dumbbells or a trap bar. I love trap bar carries because it creates freedom of movement for the most part, not as much as farmer's carries, but lots of freedom of movement, so you have to really stabilize. So I love a trap bar carry. Different kinds of farmer's walks, you know, like front rack, suitcase, overhead even, alternating, that kind of stuff, right? Picking up heavy sandbag, like anything that's going to put you in a position where you might be slightly compromised. So that's what's going to happen in the field, right? If we're talking about picking something or somebody up off the ground, you're never going to be in perfect like sumo position, squatting down, you know, leveraging all that kind of stuff, right? It's not going to happen. So you got to find ways to be strong in positions in which you might not normally be strong, right? And that's not to say I need to put these guys in all sorts of weird ass positions and like expose them to stimulus that they're not ready for or that is going to hurt them, right? But how do we improve functional capacity within the context of what I'm able to provide them? So again, how would I then program like let's say a week worth of strongman training for one of my teams? So I think I would stick with the basic conjugate principles, right? So max effort lower, repetition or dynamic effort upper, dynamic effort lower. Well, and then Wednesday would be an off day. Thursday would be dynamic effort lower, and then Friday would be a max effort upper. That's assuming they come in 4 days a week, which is what most of my teams do. So like Monday could be a deadlift variation, right? It could also be a squat variation, right? But again, if we were looking at things through the lens of just like a traditional strongman program or philosophy, you're probably not going to squat as much. However, like I argued, or like I talked about before, this motherfucking thing. There we go. That's better. Squatting is still important, right? So if you put on a rotation. So normally what I do is I go squat, deadlift, squat. So if you wanted to focus more on the deadlift as your main movement, you can go deadlift, squat, deadlift, right? And just repeat that every 3 weeks. So Monday would be max effort lower, so a deadlift or a squat variation. Tuesday would be a repetition effort upper. So what I would probably do there, that's where I would include my bench press. Do like a 5x5 close grip with ascending, like basically a linear periodization or linear progression over time until failure. Wednesday would be either an off day or a self-directed ESD or energy system development day. Thursday would be dynamic effort lower, so that's where I would also include squats. You're still getting squat and deadlift, probably versus chains, just because chains are easier to set up and they're not as complicated or as finicky, persnickety as bands. And then Friday would be a max effort upper, which again could be either a press or a bench, right? An overhead or a bench press, or a variation of the two, right? I think that there's, again, I talked about like going overhead super heavy. Probably gotta be careful with that just because most of the guys aren't exposed to that kind of stimulus right away or as often as like a lifter, as a true lifter might be. So I think it's important to sort of microdose that stimulus in or that volume in, right? So I'm not gonna have my guys go straight into a 1 rep axle overhead push press or something like that, right? Or you know, an axle, like a continental clean and jerk. That's not gonna happen, right? Like, let's be smart, let's be real. Maybe we do like a heavy 5 or a heavy triple and then a heavy single, right? Run like a 5-3-1 style scheme for a few weeks to get guys exposed to that stimulus and then expose them to the true one rep max stuff, right? And then all of your accessory work you can build in as you would normally would within the conjugate. You have a secondary movement. So if we deadlift, I'd probably do like a good morning. If we squatted, I'd probably do an RDL, right? I just like that pairing of those two exercises. And then of course each day has ESD components built into the back end, whether it's a run or it's an off foot conditioning or some type of carry circuit. I love carry circuits. I think they've been really great for the teams that I've put them in with, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, just like powerlifting, this is what I was trying to actually formulate earlier. There's extremes, right? So like powerlifting is squat, bench, deadlift. It's not geared or it's not raw. You know, there's context and there's criteria and divisions within powerlifting, right? But powerlifting as a general training methodology is squat, bench, deadlift, right? Now, how you go about executing those three movements varies from person to person or philosophy to philosophy, right? But there's extremes, right? There's extreme raw, there's extreme geared, you know, and like neither one of my guys, my operators don't need to live in either extreme. They need to live kind of right in the middle, like what is going to be most appropriate for them, right? Same thing with strongman. I don't need my guys doing Hercules holds or, you know, like log clean and presses for max or for time. Like, I don't need to do that kind of stuff, right? So when I say strongman, when I say powerlifting, it's very loosely formatted, right? Again, it's not like we're loading anchors and dragging chains and loading barrels and doing all, and like, you know, kegs over a bar, that kind of, we're not doing that kind of stuff, right? We're doing very simple but effective, again, I hate the term, but functional training that is going to ideally lend itself towards chronic general physical preparedness across a projected horizon. So again, more to come, more to follow on all this, but I think that strongman is going to be a really beneficial and I think really enjoyable addition to my programming for my ODA. So from a coaching perspective, from a professional portfolio perspective, I think it's going to be really beneficial and change things up just from the straight bar. So I know I'm enjoying it, even though today sucked. It's fun to do different things. So please like, comment, subscribe, follow, whatever. 2 Instagram accounts. Personal is at Jimberjacked. Professional and ammonia is at Hammer Strength and Ammonia. So feel free to check both of those out. Please follow, whatever. Stay tuned for more updates. And as always, don't waste the pain.